now. Hello and welcome to the Ask JP podcast, where we tackle the issues of the day. Today, I am extremely excited to have Morgan Lamandre with the Sexual Trauma Assault and Response team.
Response.
Awareness and Response. You're right. I'm on the board and I can't get the name right. That's typical me. Morgan and I have worked together for a very long time, so long that I've forgotten how we met. Morgan, maybe you could illuminate me.
Yeah, so it was in 2015. It was the beginning of 2015. We just had a lot of news reporting on the rape kit billing situation. You and Helena Moreno had made some statements in the media. And I remember thinking that you in particular, between that and this other bill about doing a survey of who has untested rape kits, I was like, I think JP's an ally. And it was the first time I really ever reached out to a legislator. And so I emailed your district office asking if I could somehow meet with you. And I got a response. I'm trying to remember your legislative aide. Was it Crystal?
Crystal.
Yeah. And she was responded and was like, when can you meet? And I was just like, oh my gosh, this is gonna happen. And I remember we met in January of 2015 at your office at the Capitol, and I came in and you were in your red sneakers and just kind of cool, hey, what's going on? And I just remember thinking, oh my God, he's like a human being and everything. And he's just so cool. And the thing that I remember most about you is that I told you the story of a client I had where she had been raped and the law enforcement officer was explaining what he was going to charge the perpetrator with. And he told her, I'm going to charge the perpetrator with simple rape. And when he left, she turned to me and said, how could my rape be called simple? And I told you that I wanted us, Louisiana, to change the law from aggravated rape, forcible rape, and simple rape to first degree rape, second degree rape, and third degree rape. And I thought that was an impossible thing to do. And you're like, done. What else can we do? And that was the year you put an agenda legislative package together. And I remember you had to get many authors because you only had the 5 non-fiscal bills. And so even though you may not have been the primary author, I don't know, we had 20 bills that session, and you were still running all of those bills, even though you were not maybe the primary author. And so after that year, we no longer had simple rape in Louisiana. And that's the story I like to tell about how
now that you've refreshed I remember 95% of that, because you have kids too, so some of your brain gets replaced with crayons and drawings. But I remember the simple rape conversation just because I remember thinking that has got to be the most frustrating, offensive experience ever to have someone be like, yeah, it'll be simple rape. And it's so there's just the term, when you say it out loud, it just sounded so awful. Right. And it seems so common sense to say, no, there's no such, Louisiana, our laws are written so weird that if you go to other states around the country, laws are written in almost a mathematical fashion. There's different elevations, first, right, second degree, whatever. In Louisiana, we have all these weird names. It's because every legislator, when they make up a new law, they just make up a name for it. And I mean, I don't want to get into a larger discussion about how we have 17 different versions of home invasion, which right, we do, but I really appreciate that story. I always appreciate being reminded of times when I did something that was good. I think everyone does that, but I mean, you guys do such yeoman work, and I think it's a perfect lead into, I think a lot of people are, and we'll get into the LSU situation shortly, but people are become more and more familiar with S.T.A.R and the work that S.T.A.R does, to the point that after the LSU story broke most recently, you guys have really struggled because you've had I think Rachel said, a 50% increase in requests for assistance. And I want you to kind of give us a brief overview of what S.T.A.R is and what S.T.A.R does, and really what you do. Because I think people need to understand that S.T.A.R is more than just a nonprofit that provides services. You actually are victims advocates.
Yeah. So I will say S.T.A.R started out as a rape crisis center as part of the East Baton Rouge District Attorney's Office. And I started out as a volunteer back then. But in 2012, we formed a nonprofit. So that way we could serve more people than just in the Baton Rouge area. And then also not many victims go through the criminal justice system. So we started out in 2012. I started at S.T.A.R in 2013. And at that point, we really only had counseling, and we went to the hospital whenever a survivor had been assaulted to be with them. First day I started, I was like, we need a legal program. And Rachel's like, well, that's kind of crazy. Like, what are you talking about? And I'm like, we'll talk about it again. At the end of 2013, at this point, because I had taken the bar exam July of 2013, I had passed the bar. So then I was an attorney, but I had at that point fallen in love with working at S.T.A.R. And there was a grant to apply for to open up a legal program. And everyone's like, you're not going to get this grant. It's so competitive. Of course, we got it. And so then in 2015, we opened up our legal program. But at that point, we had such a good reputation in Baton Rouge, and a donor from New Orleans. And just so all of your listeners know, I am from New Orleans originally. Still have a 504 cell phone number. You know, you can take the girl out of New Orleans. You can't take New Orleans out of the girl. But we had somebody from New Orleans who was like, you know, we don't have anything in New Orleans that specifically focuses on sexual assault. Obviously, there are other victim service agencies, but when you have sexual assaults, and primarily those that are impacted by sexual assault, it's not just intimate partners. So you have household members, you know, and so they had a family member who had experienced sexual assault, and they didn't really have the ability to get the services they were needing. So they decided that they wanted to use their resources to help us open up a location in New Orleans, which you were at our ribbon cutting ceremony for us. And it was something I was so proud of, because being from New Orleans originally and knowing just the way people appreciate services in New Orleans, I would say is much different in a sense from Baton Rouge. And like, we were really welcomed in New Orleans. So at that point, we had a full advocacy services. That meant we went to the hospital with survivors. We did case management. We had a 24/7 hotline. We had counseling, legal representation. And just to be clear, all of our services for survivors are completely free. Survivors don't get charged for any of our services. And from there, we kind of expanded to Central Louisiana, which when you go from New Orleans all the way to Alexandria, the culture change shifts dramatically in having to deal with all of those things. But S.T.A.R in general, I mean, you know, without us in these areas, survivors wouldn't really have access to these free and confidential services. And S.T.A.R's legal program is the only one in the state that is exclusively providing services to non-intimate partner sexual assault survivors. And a lot of people think that legal for survivors is usually in the criminal justice system, but that's not true. I mean, survivors have plenty of legal needs, but you can't necessarily go to legal aid. And if you went there and you said, oh, I have evidence, I have my property that was seized from me during a criminal investigation, I want to get it back, they're going to be like, well, I don't know what to do with you. But for us, we specialize in sexual assault. So we know we use the victims' rights laws to be able to enforce them for survivors. So I could go on about that. But I think, you know, the other thing that started to happen is we started to see a lot of things that survivors were experiencing. And that's when I kind of had the audacity to email you and sort of say, we keep saying we need these changes in the law, and like nobody was doing it. And I kind of got, I don't know, I just didn't think there was any reason to wait anymore. So that's when I sort of met you, met Helena Moreno, and just started asking legislators like to help us out and get some laws passed for survivors. And since then, I would say I do believe people know who we are at the Capitol now.
And that's a great lead in, because obviously many people kind of most recently got exposed to S.T.A.R and what y'all do during the ongoing high drama that is the LSU. And I mean, in all honesty, it's more of LSU is certainly the focus, but I mean, it's a higher ed epidemic of inactivity and non-attention to sexual assault on college campuses, on all the campuses of universities and colleges in Louisiana.
Mhm.
And LSU has really been the focus, but really, from what you and I both know, it's kind of the tip of the iceberg. It was not unique to LSU, so to speak. But maybe kind of give my listeners how S.T.A.R got involved in the initial kind of legislative review of what's going on with LSU and kind of how your interaction with them has gone, and kind of what we can talk a little bit at the end, like of this part of how that morphed into bills. So why don't we talk about how did y'all get involved in the LSU investigation?
Well, I will say when the USA Today articles came out, and I guess I may be giving a little bit away, but we were contacted before the USA Today
Right.
article came out because here and there, I mean, we helped plenty of survivors, and I think the reporters were being told, contact people at S.T.A.R, see if, and so I was given some reporters a lot of background, and we had represented survivors at LSU. And in my experience, I had represented some survivors who, in particular, had their cases overturned and sent back to hearing panels. And so I also had survivors
Wait,
that just,
pause for 1 second, 'cause I want people to understand that you had victims who had gone through the process, who their abusers had been found guilty through the campus process, and someone high up at LSU overturned that and sent it back to the panel. So your victim had to go back and do that same process over again.
exactly. And what was even crazier,
Wow.
LSU's process, I will say, that was unlike any process from before, because we've helped survivors. Actually, a lot of education cases, we help a lot of students in New Orleans, Xavier, Loyola, Tulane, UNO. I feel like there's been others, but SUNO. But in LSU, they had this weird process where it was like, you have an investigation, you have a finding, then you go to the next person who has an investigation, has a finding, and then the perpetrator can appeal all these decisions, then they can appeal to the hearing panel. So it's like, it was this nuanced process that was really multiple processes. So to have to do it all over again, and there would always be an argument, and it was, the president at the time, F. King Alexander, and that's why I kind of made a statement about him at that first hearing, because he would say, oh, well, this was a due process issue or something along those lines. But I'm an attorney, I understand due process. And, in one particular case, I didn't think there was any due process issue. In the other case, the perpetrator had lied during the hearing. So during the hearing, the panel found him responsible for lying. Well, what the argument was, well, you didn't have enough, you should have had another hearing for that lying charge, right? Well,
That is that
why
that
did you have
that
to?
I mean, that has to be extremely frustrating, because during a legal proceeding, if you get caught lying and you commit perjury, number one, they don't stop the trial and go, wait, hold up. We got to go have another hearing on the perjury. We're going to stop everything we're doing. Nothing else matters. And two, if you lie in a proceeding, you can't be mad the panel holds you being a liar against you. And it
Right,
seems using that line of logic, you say, wait, he lied, but they shouldn't have held the lying against him when they found him not credible.
right. And I think in the end, though, if they wanted to say it's a due process issue, but why did you have to retry the sexual assault stuff? And I know we're using legal terms, but it is an administrative process. But it just, for survivors going through that process alone, is a barrier. And all they want most of the time is for them to not have to see their abusers on campus. So when the Hush Blackwell report came out, and I think, as usual, I make a lot of noise on social media, and I'm not usually afraid to say when I think there's an injustice happening to survivors. And some of the women's caucus had contacted me because they saw some of the things I had been saying. Reporters were interviewing us, and so they invited me to come to the first hearing. because they wanted to see what I had to say about sort of everything that's been happening. And then they kept asking me to come back, and they would ask me questions because we had this direct experience with survivors at LSU. So I think, for lack of a better way to phrase it, they knew I could fact check some of the people, in real time, which is exactly what I was doing at those hearings and texting the legislators. And that's where some of their questions came from, because, it's one thing to be told, well, this is how the process is now. Okay, but you're talking about maybe the most recent change you made within the last 2 weeks, not how it was when everything was going down. So that's sort of how we got involved. And then afterwards, because we have such a good reputation, and this was actually before the hearing, it was right after the USA Today article, to be fair. LSU had contacted S.T.A.R because they're like, well, you all seem to be experts. Can you help us with training? And, so we were able to do some contract work to consult with them, but that's sort of a separate thing from what I do. That's our CEO and VP and our community side of things. So I like to be a little separate from all of that, because I don't want to be involved with that, because obviously no matter what happens with my survivors, and the only thing I make sure of is that they know in our contracts that in the end there may be interest that survivors have, and that we would pursue whatever the survivor's interest was, irrespective of if they gave us any money. Because I think sometimes people believe that when you give them a check, you owe some sort of allegiance to them. And I think we made it clear from the beginning that what the services were for, and that in the end we are for survivors. So
I mean, I think that's very important. I think it goes to the credibility of the organization. I think that I know that despite how much I've learned over the years doing work with you and doing work for survivors, it is always amazing to me how there is a lack of humanity in people with dealing with these kind of issues. Like, when you have a president of a university kind of frivolously overturning stuff for half made up issues, it really is particularly callous in that he has no level of accountability to a survivor who he's doing that to, because it's obvious he doesn't really give a crap. And when you look at the fact that you worked, and I made this joke, I was at a press conference yesterday where I talked about how S.T.A.R basically wrote half of 172. Like, you basically have a co-author credit with Elena and I, because a lot of the issues that have come up with this LSU hearings, we already addressed them 6 years ago. We had legislation we drafted that we passed, that everyone signed off on, that addressed a tremendous amount of issues, especially stuff dealing with Victims' Bill of Rights. And when you look at what's come out in this investigation, and I'm sure USA Today is not done with universities across the state, it's obvious they just didn't give a crap about the law if they understood it to begin with.
Right. Well, and I think that, when we were going through the law, and I remember we had to make some compromises with that bill to get it through. But even the compromise piece, I don't know if you remember this. Remember, it was like, we in the end had to put, when funding is available for the climate service.
Yeah, that was really dumb.
Well,
it was necessary because the legislature, the money committees tend to lean heavy Republican, and if you've got a fiscal note in any bill, they use it as an excuse to kill it. So we basically had to put in the bill when funding is available, so that the bill wouldn't have a fiscal note, so we could pass it. But at the same token, it created an opportunity for people who are bad actors who didn't want to do it. They'd say, well, no funding's available, so we're not going to do it. So, I mean, I think, but didn't Barbara Carpenter fix that?
Yeah, so she fixed that in 2018, but it's kind of like, you'll hear people say, show me your budget and I'll show you my priorities, right?
Right.
So that was never really going to be prioritized until it was mandated. So I'm glad she fixed that. But one of the things too is, when we were working on that bill, we were not working on that bill thinking through it like bad actors, right? We want to assume people are going to do the right thing, but my new rule is we have to look at every bill we draft as if we are a bad actor. Like, how are we going to find the loopholes? Because there's no way we could have imagined. We really didn't. Nobody wanted to put a penalty like, oh, if you don't report something that you're going to get fired or anything like that. But like, the way we drafted the other bill, like, we just thought people, I guess, would be doing.
Well, I mean, for the most part, when we drafted the other bill, it was really focused on regulating the interpersonal relationships between students. Like, really, the focus was there's a survivor and there's a student abuser, and here are the rules govern them.
Right.
With the LSU investigation, we found out that what do you do if the abuser is an administrator? We didn't contemplate that. Then on top of that, we also dealt with the idea of we assumed that administrators, abuser or not, they all would know they're mandatory reporters and have to report what's going on. And furthermore, that they do it because it was the right thing to do. We now know that is not the case. So we could kind of go into the bills kind of as they are now. That I know that there's a bill that Representative Freeman's doing. There's another bill that Representative Davis and Senator Mizell are doing, and they both are very similar. But some of the things that are in them that stuck out to me were we now have language in there saying if you don't report, you get terminated. And the reason why it's important and the reason why we never thought we'd have to do it, but we're doing it, is because you want to make sure everyone, whether you're a TA or a tenured professor, if you're made aware of the fact that someone's abused and they come to you, you have to respect that person's privacy, because obviously a victim, the survivor, is paramount, but you don't get to substitute your own personal opinion or your own personal judgment. You have to start the process. Right. And we figured out pretty early on in drafting these bills that if you don't put that language in there, one, you don't put any hook in for the university to pursue it. But two, for employees, when you put in the law, this is grounds for termination, there is no out. I mean, whether you're a tenured professor or you're a TA, tenure means nothing if you break the law. And so, I mean, it's unfortunate we had to go to that level because we thought people would do it because they're good people. I agree with you. At this point, when you're doing bills like this from now on, you have to do it from the standpoint of, I can't do it with like the idea that if I put the framework in, people will do the right thing. I have to do a bill as if, what if they do everything wrong? Exactly. I have to make sure the victim is still covered.
And I think, when drafts were sent to me for Senator Mizell and, Representative Freeman, I was like, we really need to restructure a lot of this and be very clear, not just who this applies to, because one of the things too in the other bill, and it wasn't, I mean, I know we had thought about it, but it probably wasn't as clear, is that we really set up a good framework for once somebody becomes aware of a student victim or student survivor, and we had it set up to where they have confidential advisors and all. But what this new reiteration, or once it's revised, will do also is that it's not just if it's a student victim. If you become aware of a student perpetrator, that needs to be reported irrespective of if you don't know who the victim is. Because I think a lot of educational institutions use the excuse that they can't move forward if they don't have a victim that can tell them what happened. But if there's, like, for example, in the LSU situation, you're somebody in athletics who the perpetrator tells you, I abused this person, this is exactly what I did, you can move forward. I mean, he admitted it, right? So
but also, like, following up on that, something that was, it's real simple. It is very unlikely with many of these abusers they simply abuse one person.
Correct.
And even if you only have the fact that there is an allegation of abuse against John Smith's student, even if that particular victim decides they don't want to move forward on it, when the university is made aware that John Smith sexually abused or was accused of sexually abusing someone, when the second or third accusation comes, there's a record somewhere that this guy previously been accused of some sort of abuse. And I mean, there's a reason why even when you commit a crime in a typical law enforcement scenario, you're charged with a crime. even if you aren't prosecuted or the evidence isn't sufficient, that process is still preserved somewhere because it also helps to find patterns. And I mean, in particular, one area we found there was a lot of abuse in was we had language that said we don't want people switching universities when they're brought under accusations of abuse. Because what would happen is that members with means, they would commit a sexual assault, the university would start to investigate, and they would immediately leave the university.
Right.
And what universities used to do is they go, well, he left, investigation closed, unresolved. And they'd simply start another university. And I mean, we're now finding out after this LSU thing that there are individuals in this state who were alleged to commit sexual assault as many as 6 times, who simply hop between universities, and universities did not properly track them. So had they just followed what we had said in there regarding transcripts and communication, there's a real possible chance that almost half a dozen women wouldn't have been sexually assaulted.
So, but in that situation, which these bills will cover a loophole I never could have imagined seeing, right? Because we thought people would do the right thing. So in that situation, it was like, okay, well, once there's an investigation, right? Like you
Right.
can't just transfer. You can't just transfer. But what was happening is they received a complaint, but didn't start the investigation. So the person transferred before they started the investigation. So they said, well, because we didn't start an investigation, we only received the complaint. But because we didn't start investigating, that's why we didn't have to do anything on the that should not. I think.
No, I mean it goes back to that lack of decency. The spirit of the law. I mean, when you get that technical, and I'm not going to get like truly conspiracy theorist because I don't want to like change this hat for a tinfoil one, but it almost makes you wonder if you've got a connected perpetrator who the university tells the person you need to bounce as quickly as possible because once we open the investigation, we have to report it. Because I mean, the fact this guy did this, we can't really go into the guys, but this person did this multiple times. It was done in a fashion that kind of expresses that he knew exactly what the hell he was doing. And I mean, it's just,
I think he did.
yeah. I mean, but it's frustrating. I'm looking forward. I know I've worked very closely with Senator Mizell and Representative Davis on their bills, and I will probably be testifying when those bills come up. But it's important for people to know that, like, but for survivors finding a voice, both with S.T.A.R and other agencies and groups like that, to come forward and say something, it's just so frustrating that in this day and age, that with everything people know, in particular as it revolves around sexual assault on college campuses, that this keeps happening. And it just, the fact that it keeps happening, it's disheartening, it's frustrating, but we are so thankful that S.T.A.R is in the gap, providing a voice and support to these victims to come forward. But let's talk about New Orleans. Obviously, you guys are in New Orleans, you're in Alexandria, and you're in Baton Rouge. And something I find fascinating is like each jurisdiction is completely different. Tell me some differences between them. I mean, I'm sure that's not only an issue of better or worse, but just how is it different the way S.T.A.R operates, generally speaking? Because I know you're in one box and the advocates are in another box, but like as you see it, how is it different in each jurisdiction?
Well, we'll say because legal, so we have advocacy, counseling, and legal, but because legal covers all the jurisdictions, because we don't have a separate legal in each branch, we have to navigate all of the different personalities, all of the different things that are happening. I will say New Orleans is the most progressive when it comes to policies and actually following laws. So for example, we've had a law in the books forever now that says you can't polygraph a victim, or you can't ask a victim to take a polygraph, you can't require them as part of an investigation. That is very clear in New Orleans. In the Alexandria area and jurisdictions, law enforcement jurisdictions around there, not so much. So we're like really backwards. in sort of the central Louisiana area. But then at the same time, like the dynamics are just people's knowledge and awareness of sexual assault. Like I still think there's some challenges about marital rape in Alexandria, you know, like whether or not it's something you can prosecute somebody for. Like the attitudes are very different. It's kind of like, you know, the further you know, you start at New Orleans and then the further you go I-10
The
west,
further you go west and north, it just gets, I mean,
more
that's fair. I mean, I know that you and I worked very closely. New Orleans has kind of had a 180 insofar as how progressive it is on sexual assault, because I remember 2 years back, you and I worked together when our district attorney was kind of outed for jailing sexual assault victims to compel their testimony. And in particular, as we kind of dug into it, it came out that there were instances where the sexual assault victim in custody spent more time in jail than the abuser ultimately got through plea deals. So
right.
to kind of like put some meat on that bone for listeners, it's sort of like if they have to jail the survivor for 2 months until trial, and then when they get the accused in court and he pleads out to a week in jail, that means that the person who was raped spent more time in jail than the person who was the rapist.
Right, right.
And
one of the things that
Morgan.
happened too was that there was not necessarily any regard for if the victim was in the same jail as the perpetrator. The perpetrator could have been held, you know, had too high of a bail or something. There was no regard for whether or not the perpetrator was in the same jail as the victim. But, and I will say that that's where in New Orleans, there was definitely outcomes was a big focus for a long time, and sort of what the district attorney's office thought was justice. I will say that, you know, justice for survivors looks different for everyone. So not every survivor wants jail, or they don't want as long of a sentence. So in the situations where they were being jailed longer than the perpetrator, I mean, they were likely losing their jobs, you know, just so much trauma, you know, and it gets to the point where the rape is hard, but then everything that they experience after the fact is even more traumatic. And so I do have hope that with this new administration, for the victims who want it, there are more options for justice. And that could look like restorative justice. Now, that's not for everyone. I have a client in New Orleans right now who, you know, and just based on the facts of that case, it's a serial predator. He's going to be on trial for multiple victims. He doesn't need to be released probably ever, you know, but that's for those victims and that scenario. I think
but see, that's a super important point that I think people don't get when they talk about sexual assault survivors and justice, because there's justice and there's vengeance. And
yes.
For some survivors, they want different things. Like you may have a survivor who wants an apology, who wants a person to acknowledge what they did, admit what they did, and validate that survivor went through this, it happened, and that they know they did this wrong. It's like part of what I find kind of refreshing with Mr. Williams as our new DA, with Jason, is that he's focused on the process and does not begin with a predetermined outcome. I used to fight with Leon Canizero all the time over the death penalty because the death penalty was the outcome. And I remember I talked to victims' families, people who were murdered, and they'd say, I don't want the death penalty. I'm a God-fearing Christian. I think it's a sin to murder someone. I don't want to do it. And that office would say, well, screw you. We want to make an example of this person, so we're going to do X. And when you're an office focused on outcomes, that's no longer about justice for a victim. It's about getting the outcome you want as the government, irregardless of that. And I mean, you're going to have victims of survivors, of sexual assault, who they want a certain outcome. The outcome is they want the person to apologize. They want it to be on the record. They want to know what happened. You have other ones like your current client, And I mean, I saw them when I was involved in law enforcement, that if you're a serial rapist and only one victim is going the distance on that rapist, they almost feel a sense of obligation to see it through, because they don't, they know they're doing it not just for themselves, but for every woman that guy will encounter afterwards. So like they're going to go the distance, and those people need to be embraced, protected, and shown. But furthermore, it's like when you talk about the other thing that has to happen with jailing victims, they're different communities, affected, displaced communities. I'll give you an example. Like one of the big things when Leon used to jail sexual assault victims is you would have drug dealers who would sexually abuse drug addicts. And they would have these horrendous experiences where they'd be locked up going into a trial. That person would get that 7 days in jail. They spend 2 months in jail, and it would get out on the streets of, it's not even worth reporting it. If you report it, you're going to be in jail for 2-3 months. He's going to get a week. Don't even do it. And it's like, it doesn't, and not only doesn't help as far as convicting the person, you really create an environment where, because the office treats people so badly, they're disinclined to help you find rapists. Not because they don't want justice, it's because they don't think the office will do justice. And I mean, it's especially frustrating for y'all, because when you have someone come in who's like, I was raped, and you're like, well, this is an excellent case, let's go to the DA. And they go, I don't want to go to the DA. That DA, I've heard he does some really bad shit. Then that is problematic.
Well, and you know, for us, when survivors come to us and they just want to know their options, we provide them with that information. We let them know they are in control, because at that point, especially if they go the criminal justice route, once they go that route, they kind of don't have very much control over that process. And it's interesting because you'll hear, there are times when we have conversations like people who are in the criminal justice field, law enforcement, district attorneys, the thought that we wouldn't push a survivor to go that route is like, you know, a shock for them. But it's like, what would you expect when, for us, we would have no credibility if we did that. If we said, no, go this route, yet based on different experiences of survivors, and, you know, there's different, people, I think, assume that, oh, if your rape looks a certain way, if it's the Lifetime movie type rape, that your experience is going to look different from somebody who, you know, was a sex worker and was sexually assaulted. Meaning like, oh, people who are sex workers don't typically get treated with respect when they go to the criminal justice personnel, or they may even face arrest. But it's not the research is clear. It doesn't matter who you are. If you go the criminal justice route, your outcome, your mental health, your emotional health, physical health, typically is worse off than if you don't report. And that that's based on Rebecca Campbell's research. I mean, it's based on what we know happens to survivors. So who could credibly tell a survivor, yeah, your case is great, and we think it'll be prosecuted, but knowing that there's actual science behind the fact that even though your case is great, you going that route is going to be detrimental to your overall well-being.
Well, I mean, I think when you look at the origins of S.T.A.R, I have to imagine with Rachel, that's the reason why S.T.A.R spun off from being a rape crisis center. Because when you're a rape crisis center attached to a DA's office, you're basically a feeder for rape cases at that point. I mean, the assumption is that the person comes to you in crisis because they were sexually assaulted, that you provide them counsel and support with the aim of helping the DA be able to form a case. And to your point, it's not an issue of, do we think rapists should go to jail? Yes, rapists should go to jail, but it's an issue of, until the system evolves to a point where victims can go through that process and not be devastated by the process, and even after getting the correct outcome, not have their own detrimental experience, it's hard to recommend it. And really the way people should interpret that is, it's incumbent upon us as a society to create processes that are so holistic and so survivor centric that they don't have detrimental health and mental health outcomes. Because I mean, that's why the outcomes are so fraught, even if they get a conviction. Because you're right. I mean, uh, one of the areas in which I kind of deviate from the DA is that I know that his office is taking a position that when someone's eligible for parole, they're not going to oppose it. One area that was a red flag to me is that what about rape survivors? Like, if a rape survivor wants to oppose parole for an individual,
Are we going to notify him too?
that, well, I mean, it would seem that they need to know that if that person's eligible for parole before their time is up, someone's going to be with them when they're doing that hearing. And historically, if you go across the state, whether you love or hate DAs, that DA is always sitting next to that victim and saying, I'm here with you. And it's great that I'm sure S.T.A.R could be that group if there's no one else to go, but you never need to have victims of sexual assault when they're looking at something like that. There has to be a nuance to it. And I mean, you have to make sure that if they're going there, if someone gets 35 years and they're eligible at 20, and that survivor is really concerned for their well-being or other women's well-being, and they want to show up to oppose it, somebody has to be sitting with them, because it's a very every interaction with law enforcement for a survivor is a traumatic event, just like everything related to the rape, reenacting as a traumatic event or a reliving of that situation. And that parole hearing, I think, is going to be another one of those instances where it's like, it's a very traumatic event to go sit in front of a parole board who's going to control the fate of what happens to the person that sexually assaulted you. The idea of them doing that alone is it's kind of gut wrenching for me. I mean, it's one of those things where hopefully a fully funded S.T.A.R with lots of money, please donate to S.T.A.R, can help fill that gap. But it's almost a gap that government should be doing anyway, because that's part of the compact with a victim when they testify. It's like, if you don't have to, as an office, of a policy of we are going to oppose the parole, but you should have a victim centric policy of, if the victim's going to oppose parole, we will accompany that victim to support what they're doing. Right. Which is very, you know what I mean? It's a nuanced position, but it's really one you have to consider, because it's like, it's just, and like, I would never for the life of me, like, challenge the progressive bona fides of Jason in his office. They're fantastic, but it's just, these are the kind of nuances that you have to really have conversations about, because it's a really scary experience. And I always want to feel like that if that were to happen to someone I knew, or someone I don't know, that they just won't be there by themselves. Just very, very scary.
Right. Well, and I think, those are conversations that hopefully, because right now I do see a lot of policies coming out of the district attorney's office, some that need to happen, some that are really good, that are going to help people. I just hope that he'll sit down with S.T.A.R in particular, because, I know he sat down with like the DV groups and maybe before the campaign, but I would like for him to sit down with my survivor who, whenever we're meeting with her current ADA, she's just kind of presenting some of these concerns she has, and the ADAs are sort of in their bubble prosecuting the case. And it's like, I really hope that we can connect directly with Jason, because I do believe, based on what he has said, and also, we went before him at the city council with the resolution about, condemning the practices of Leon regarding the jailing. Like, I do believe that he has an understanding of the dynamics of sexual assault. But I hope that in an effort to make the office progressive, and I mean, like, there was so many bad things that happened out of that office. I mean, all of our case law, all of our defendant right cases at the Supreme Court. I mean, there's just one that, being in law school and all, it was like Smith v. Kane. I don't know if you remember that one, where literally it was 8-1, and even Antonin Scalia was telling the ADA, he's like, would you stop arguing with us over whether or not this was Brady material? Of course it was Brady material. Stop arguing,
Right. I'm gonna guess the one was Clarence Thomas, wasn't it?
Of course it was.
It's like, even when Anthony Scalia is like, this is BS, Clarence is like, I'd allow it. I mean, it just, sorry, but the being aggressive is whenever I hear it's like 8-1 with a Scalia court, I'm like, that's always Clarence Thomas. Clarence Thomas is the guy who's like, did they kill him? They probably could have killed him too. Doesn't really matter to me.
You should go listen to the oral arguments. It's one that, I mean, I made my husband watch it, listen to it at one point because it was just so...
God bless Jeremy, because I'm sure you make him watch all kinds of stuff. He's like, I am interested, but even as I listen to it with you, I'm not as interested as you think I should be.
Listen, let me tell you about Jeremy. Jeremy makes me look at dad jokes and listen to dad jokes. And so
you cannot ever hold it against a dad to make you listen to dad jokes.
Dad jokes are so funny.
It is the rite of passage for all dads to make the entire family listen to dad jokes. I did not even realize until my 12-year-old was old enough to fight with me with his mustache and his height that I was telling too many. I'm like, that's a good joke. He's like, it's a dad joke, Dad. And I'd be like, it was a fantastic joke. And he's like, you're such a dad, you don't know when you're giving dad jokes. Anyway, I'm not going to digress into the sadness that I have in my soul when people call my jokes dad jokes, but I feel Jeremy's pain. Maybe he and I can, like, one day we'll commiserate how our humor is lost upon these young people who don't get how fantastic we are. But I know we're running long. I would like to, in closing, first, Morgan, thank you so much for being on here. You provide so much information, especially regarding the process, both at college campuses and in local law enforcement that victims go through. And people really need to hear that, because really, I've found people are very well intentioned, but they often substitute their judgment for a victim's judgment. And unless you've been sexually assaulted by that individual, you don't really have the ability to go, well, I'd do this differently.
Exactly.
I mean, what I would like you to talk to people about, kind of as the closing argument, so to speak, is what they can do to help S.T.A.R and what they could do this session to help Louisiana tackle the epidemic of college sexual assault and really we turned the page 6 years ago. I guess we're turning the page again. Turn the page another time. Maybe not turn it again for 20 years versus 6.
Right. Well, what most people do is they wait to get involved until it directly affects them. But the truth is, every person in Louisiana either has been affected by sexual assault, or they know somebody who's been affected by sexual assault, or there's somebody in their life that was affected by sexual assault and they just don't know it yet. Everyone has known somebody who has experienced sexual assault. And there are so many things in our state that we get wrong, and we wait until it's too late before, the only reason why we're actually here, to fix once again what we thought we already fixed is because of the media. And so I think the first thing is to actually pay attention to what your elected officials are doing, because one of the things too, and JP, throughout the years at the legislature, you saw what was happening at the Capitol with just the sexist comments and things like people are voting no on bills that would help survivors, would directly impact them. And if you aren't paying attention to what's happening at the Capitol and you're just taking people's word for it, you're gonna, be missing all of the information you need. Our legislators are not always doing the right thing. And if you're watching, you can hold them accountable. But as far as like getting involved, obviously S.T.A.R, like you said, we do not get state funding because Louisiana, only one state of maybe 2 or 3 in the country that does not provide state funding for sexual assault services. So when we lose a grant that we have to apply for, the only way to fill it up, fill the gaps is through donors, unfortunately. So we're definitely a little behind right now. So people could certainly donate. We need volunteers. We need people to be with survivors at the hospital. And then also start looking at whatever the practices are of whether it's your school, your employer, everyone should be having conversations about how to prevent and respond to sexual assault, sexual harassment in their lives, you know, whether, like I said, work, education. So start getting involved and pay attention, and don't accept when people are joking about sexual violence, because it's not a joke.
Well,
So
I think that's a great place to close. I really appreciate you being here today, Morgan. It means a lot to me. I know it means a lot to people who are really trying to educate themselves on the issue and what's going on in Baton Rouge. And I look forward to working with you this session, trying to resolve some of this stuff in a more definitive way. And hopefully, like I said, next time this rears its ugly head, we'll be, you know, old grandparents with some random loophole we have to correct, rather than looking at universities and the state kind of ignoring the laws we keep passing. So, with that, thank you everyone for listening to this episode of Ask JP. Like, subscribe if you like what we're doing over here. We'll drop a comment, let us know what we could be doing different. And honestly, I'm going to try and work in throughout this season doing some Q&A. So if you have particular questions from this episode you want answered, I'd be happy to follow up in a future episode. So thank y'all so much. I really appreciate it. And Morgan, thank you for your time.
all right, thank you.